Okay, welcome everyone. I'm just going to do a short introduction of Susan, although you're all here because you know Susan so well. I was going to start off with, I've finally arrived because I'm sharing a stage with Susan, but actually she sat down, so I can't really claim that. But I'd feel honoured if I was sharing a stage with the great Susan Stepney. So Susan's work first came to my attention in the very early days. So I heard we were going to recruit her into the department and the university. And I'd seen some of her early work and heard some of her previous work on things like Mondex, formal methods and security. And I kind of assumed that was the plan. And since then, it turned out what I thought was the plan wasn't the plan. So Susan's done some amazing work. You know, most of us just use baths for washing, but she used them for like computing. We talk about, we might have mold and bacteria, she'd again turn it into computing. And then if you had something like, I don't know, Mr. Blobby, she'd work out how a way to morph the shape, etc., to do computing. So she's gone from this person who does this really formal, predictable, provably safe computing into the world of doing really adventurous computing. She's also contributed a lot to the department. She's been a constant source of advice, both to the department, the institution, and places like EPSERC. She's led a variety of things, helped set up various things like the original York Computing Systems, Complex Computing Systems group, ICSI. Started off in a biology porter cabin, and eventually they built her a building, Ron Cook Hub, to house the centre in. She was also heavily involved in the design of the EM1 building back in the day and had really great plans for what that would be. And now she's kind of moving into retirement phase. We have plans for what to do with it next, which hopefully will actually realise some of the original vision with things like walkways. So we'll see what they said. She's also won lots and lots of awards, and a colleague sent me a list of the awards earlier, things like the Rosenberg Award and the Julian Francis Award. But one caught my attention, which really summarises Susan's work for me, which is one from Artificial Life, a Lifetime Achievement Award. And I sat there thinking, has she been given a Lifetime Achievement Award by an organisation called Artificial Life, or did she create an artificial life that then went on to win a Lifetime Achievement Award? And knowing Susan, it could be either way, and it would still be this great achievement. So I'd like to introduce Susan and welcome her to the stage to give a talk. I'm sure it'll be fascinating and thought-provoking. But I also suspect this won't be a farewell, that we'll see Susan in the building and around the building still contributing even during the retirement. So Susan, over to you.
Thanks for those kind words, Ian. That's really nice. And thanks everybody for coming along. I'm really appreciative of the number of people who've come, and it's really fantastic. Thank you. So I'm going to give this talk on life as a cyber biophysical system, and you'll find out what that means, hopefully, during the course of the talk. But first of all, I want to just give a little background about my so-called career. And I really like this definition from the Oxford English Dictionary of what career means. Gallop, run, move at full speed, but more turn this way and that in running. And I think that explains the zigzag of my life, really. So I started out in astrophysics. Most of you know this. I used to be a theoretical physicist. This was a long, long, long time ago. People say, oh, I'm a physicist, but look at that date. 1984 was when I stopped. That is 40 years ago, right, okay. But that was my first time in academia. That was my undergraduate, master's, PhD, and postdoc. But I decided to leave academia, partly because it looked like that the government of the time was attempting to annihilate the universities. And so I thought it was a good time to get out. So I went into industry, and that's what you mentioned. The formal methods years, I worked for Marconi, and then I worked for Logica. And you can imagine the move from astrophysics to discrete mathematics was quite a big jump. But I managed to blag my way through that sufficiently well that worked fine. But as part of that, I got a visiting professorship at York because I was working with John Clark and Jeremy Jacob, who Jeremy couldn't be here this evening, but I spoke to him earlier. And due to that collaboration, I knew about York quite well. And so when the opportunity arose to move back into academia, I came back and then did another zigzag, and actually I completely changed my direction yet again to doing this unconventional computing. And so, you know, I've zigzagged through, and I always kind of feel like this is, I don't like to go where other people have gone. I like to try and do something a little bit different. And now I'm moving into out of academia because it seems like the government is trying to destroy the universities. But for my colleagues who are staying in, be strong. It got better after the first time. It'll get better. It will get better, honestly. It can't get worse. So my retirement, I'm calling the Zoetic years. 2024, and I've got a ... because I don't know how long this is going on for. I'm really grateful that the computer science department took a risk on appointing me 20 years ago, and I hope to be able to repay some of that also by, in the retirement, I'm very grateful that they've also appointed, or the university's appointed me a Professor Emerita after this, and I'm going to carry on, I hope, doing research, working with people here and other people. But what am I going to do research on? Well, you notice at the beginning, although you were invited to a valedictory lecture, which is just a fancy Latin way of saying goodbye talk, that actually I called it an ex-augural lecture. Professors normally give an inaugural lecture when they start, but I never gave one of those. I managed to get away with it and didn't have to, not the only one who managed that. But I thought, well, I'll give an ex-augural lecture. Is that actually a word? I looked it up, and it actually is a word, and it means what you think. It means end of an appointment rather than the beginning of an appointment. And I thought, well, I've been to inaugural lectures, and in inaugural lectures, people talk about the past, what they did in order to get to this position. So I thought, well, an ex-augural lecture, by symmetry, I ought to talk about the future. So that's what I'm going to do. So what I want to talk about is the kind of where my work has got me and where I want to move forward. So it's a journey towards, and it's the journey that's always the interesting bit, to a science and engineering discipline of all living systems. So I'm really interested in complex systems, complex computational systems, but the best and most complex computational systems is life. And so that's an interesting one to look at. So biological life, artificial life, virtual life, whatever. Can we have an encompassing theory of all of those? I don't think I myself are going to do all of that, but I want to take a few small steps in that direction, and that's what I'm going to talk about. So here's I talked about cyber biophysical. There's 3 words there, so there's a triangle. Biology, obviously, is important for the study of life. All the stuff, and that's the complexity side of it, really nice. Genetics, evolution, development, metabolism, ecology, all the kind of standard stuff of biology. But there's also physics. Physics is really important. There's the embodiment of life in material stuff and the constraints of matter and energy, thermodynamics, all encompassed in things like dynamical systems. And of course, there's the computational side, which is kind of sort of important as well, the processing of information and algorithms and so on. And then along the sides, we've got cyber-physical systems, but I'm not talking about your classical cyber-physical system of a robot with a computer brain. I'm talking about it all embodied together. So you've got embodied information processing and whatever. And I'm hoping soon to start a new project with some colleagues on some soft robotics with embodied intelligence. Biophysical stuff is the physical embodiment of life is important. And then on the computing biology axis, there's obviously things like synthetic biology, but there's things like biomimetic, bio-inspired algorithms, but also what are called self-star systems, systems that maintain themselves, systems that build themselves. This is kind of a living idea that a living system builds and maintains itself. So you bring it all together, cyber biophysical systems, but that's too long and complicated. So I'm calling it zoetic systems, so from zoe, the Greek for life. Right.
But also, there's more. It's not just the living systems, but they're in a context. So you've got you've got the components to it, but there are other ones around that it's working with, and so on. And there's natural ones around that it might want to interact with, and it needs to interact with the physical environment as well, which is energy sources and so on. And it needs to interact with the social built environment, whether it's buildings or mobile things, and also with people. And all these things need to interact together. So that's kind of the scope of us. That is a cyber biophysical system. It has to encompass all those aspects. I will make a slight digression. The non-specialists in the audience can go to sleep for the next 3 slides. Is it possible to have life inside a computer? Okay, because I've said that matter is important and critical. Can you have virtual life? Of course, for those of us, not us, sorry, not me, for those people who think that we're already living in a simulation, this question is moot, and the answer is obviously yes. But, let's not go there, definitely not going there. So there's a guy called Robert Rosen, a theoretical biologist, who says the answer to that question is no. You can't have virtual life. And the argument that he gives is, goes all the way back to a definition by Aristotle about the cause, about efficient causation, the cause that brings something into being. And that's a closed system. It's grounded in the physicality and the materiality of the world, the meaning of what's going on. And he says that simulations and programs cannot have that kind of closure that is needed for life, because they require something outside the system to define them. So in the computer terms is like the semantics of the compiler or of the programming language, whatever. And so they've got arbitrary semantics, not a grounded semantics. And so he's quite strongly says, no virtual life. Okay, like any good bit of science, there's somebody who has a different idea about this. And so Danshin has takes a very computational view of lots of aspects of what's going on in actual physical life, not just talking about information processing, but he's even talking about operating systems in cells and so on. But what he points out is that there's an essentially arbitrary mapping between the codons and the amino acids they code for. So the codons, the triplet of bases in the DNA, and then there's a mapping from that to a particular protein, so that's through the genetic code. And he says this is essentially arbitrary. And I've spoken to a variety of biologists about that. There's at least one in the audience. I saw, oh yes, Peter, who says, yes, that is true. It is essentially arbitrary. I don't know whether you still believe that. That was a long time ago. We had that. Yeah, okay, that's good. And so in some sense, already our biology is running on a virtual machine with arbitrary semantics because that coding could be different. And the idea of that is explained in his book, The Delphic Boat, which is an interesting one to read. But the important thing is, even in that case, what the philosophical arguments are saying is that the information, the data that's being coded and manipulated, and the program, the stuff that's doing the manipulation, have to be the same kind of stuff so that you can get this self-application and so you can get a system that can modify itself, which is incredibly important in biological systems. So self-modifying code is really important, and the Plasmid project, which was Peter and Simon there, started us off looking at some ways of building self-modifying code, which of course is complete anathema to computer scientists, and especially formal methodists, because the problem with self-modifying code is you don't know what it's going to do after it's self-modified. The advantage of that's exactly what you want in biology, because it's an open system. You don't know what an evolved system's going to do. Sorry, I haven't been lecturing for a while, so my voice is giving out. Yeah, so we did some work with this string mul system, which is basically a self-modifying assembly language programs and getting some really exciting results out of it. And one of the things that I want to do, and I've had a meeting with Simon, is what our next steps are going to be to move this work forward. Anyway, sorry, end of aside. So those of you who I told to go to sleep, please wake up again now. We're now on to the next bit. The important thing about this is thinking in terms of processes and dynamics. Fantastic quote, life is a verb, not a noun. Life is a process. And I came across this quote from Tim Ingold back, he said this back in the 1990s, when he was wanting to move away from very reductionist biology to an organism-centric biology. And what would that biology look like? And he had this quote, must be a biology that asserts the primacy of processes over events, relationships over entities, and development over structure. So it's about process, verbs, not about stuff, things. So concepts, processes, dynamics, relationships, so on. And so this fits really well in computational views because computation is all about process and stuff changing. But when you take the process view of life, or really of anything, what ends up is that because it's a process, it's a dynamic thing happening and changing, change is the default. And it's only stability that requires explanation. Normally you think stuff sits there, and if it changes, that requires explanation. But it's with the process view, it's the other way around. So lots of stuff about ing words, so processing, living, becoming, being, ceasing. Unfortunately, ceasing as well as dissolving away can also mean differentiating, ceasing to be one thing, becoming another. It's like a retirement process of moving from an employed person to unemployed, is that the right word? It's, right. And how might you actually then formalize that? And so there's lovely things in computing. Process algebras seem to be the right thing for this. It's just a kind of programming scheme where you just have a trace of events that are happening, never resting stream of events. And one thing I actually found quite interesting when I was looking into this is that I wasn't working in formal methods in this process algebra. I was working in standard set theory. And set theory has something called the well-foundedness axiom, or the axiom of well-foundedness, which means that sets, you can have a set, mathematical set, and the items in that set can themselves be sets, and the items in those sets can themselves be sets. But eventually, if you go far enough down, you have to reach something that's not a set. It has a bottom. It stops at some point. It's not turtles all the way down. And process algebra is different. It uses the non-well-founded set theory, which is a really bad name because it makes it sound like there's something wrong with it. There's nothing wrong with it. All it's saying is you don't have to reach the bottom. You can keep going forever if you want to. But importantly for biology, I mean, it's really nice to have the infinite chain turtles all the way down, but for biology, you want to be able to say things like, X is an element of itself, or X is an element of the set Y, which is then an element of X. You want to be able to have these circular definitions because life is kind of a circular process, a self-sustaining process. So you want to be able to have turtles all the way round. I couldn't find a diagram of turtles all the way around, but the snake eating itself is a nice example of that. Because life is an autopoietic system. So that's, what the hell does that mean? Right, auto means self and poiesis means producing. So life is a self-producing system. Life produces more life. Life produces itself. And in order to be able to think about that, you want to be able to have circular references. Okay. One thing that I find interesting about this is that the thing I was reading about non-well-founded set theory, first of all, said, well, there's hardly any difference. The axiom of well-foundedness isn't really ever used by mathematicians. But it seems to be quite important that actually the way some physicists think and some other scientists think that there is a bottom. There's kind of if you go down, you will hit something at the bottom that it has to stop. We start from atoms, maybe the elements or maybe subparticles, and then build up objects from those sets of objects. And even if you've got a holistic style of, well, I'll smash it all down into the components and then build it back up again, there's still this feeling that there's a bottom. And so I was just wondering whether our scientific intuitions about reality, about life and things like that, have actually been skewed by the underlying formalisms about how objects might be constructed, because the axiom of foundation was introduced specifically to disallow self-reference, and life is a self-referential system. There's a problem, actually, in getting further with this, because non-well-founded set theory isn't quite as well understood in general as ordinary set theory. I always say that it's not taught in kindergarten, unlike set theory. I wasn't actually taught set theory in kindergarten, but I certainly was taught it for O-level. You know, it was fairly standard stuff. And also the applications don't feel natural. Interactions aren't first-class entities. A lot of problems with process algebras tend to be about deadlock. The real world does not deadlock, as far as I'm aware. If you stop listening to me, I don't deadlock. Okay, you must be, some of you have probably already stopped listening to me, but I haven't deadlocked, and I'm not going to, don't worry. Also, other problems with them are that a lot of these things seem to be closed to endogenous novelty. Sorry for some of the fancy words, but that's novelty that's produced within the system. So you get new kinds of things happening in the system, new kinds of things added to the system, produced by the system itself. As I said, life is a self-producing system. This is coming from inside. Suddenly you need a model that can change itself to introduce new things into the model. It's like having a set of equations, and one of those equations writes new equations into that set. Okay, so that's a thing that needs to be done, and thinking of some ways of doing that. But the material side is important as well. So matter matters. So the process view is crucial. It's a process, but it's not a disembodied process. Matter is also crucial. Ignoring my side talk into virtual life, there will be analogues in there. But matter gives structure and dynamics. The matter is what embodies both the structure of stuff that encodes the information that you need, but it also enables the dynamics, it enables the processing of that information. So a system can just be thought of as a process with an identity, and an embodied system has got matter, structure, and dynamics. So it's like the ship being blown around in the wind. So some work that I've been doing with other colleagues here on physical reservoir computing. This is the closest it gets to an equation, honest, on there. There's a particular thing called an echo state network, which is a random recurrent neural network, where you only have to train the output layer, you don't have to train the weights inside. So it's very different from an ordinary neural network. And for people who don't understand what all that meant, the thing is that you can treat the computational guts as a black box. You don't need to see what's going on inside that black box. You only need to be able to observe some of the outside. And what's nice about that, that means that you can take the black box computational model, throw it away, and replace it by some physical stuff that has the right kind of behavior. And what I like to say is that behavior, all that's required is that there's matter that if you kick it, wobbles in an interesting way. And then you can watch how it wobbles, and you can use that to do computation. So you can compute with material stuff, and there's colleagues in the audience here, we're doing work on magnetic systems and making computers out of those. And then you can feed back the computed output as an input control signal, so you can kind of close the loop on these things as well if you want. So the computation that comes out can go back in and you can get a system that is kind of computing its own future. And there's some very interesting work being done by a guy and his team in Japan. Kohei Nakajima is doing some really interesting stuff there. And Martin and I are trying to get a collaboration going with him. His physical reservoir computer isn't a magnetic system, it's an octopus arm. So he's got it's a synthetic octopus arm, okay. It's a silicone arm, and he suspends it in water. It doesn't work if it's not suspended in water. It has to be suspended in water. And it can flap around, and what you do is you move the top, and that's the input to the system, is wobbling the top, and then you watch how it wobbles, and then you can, with a little bit of training of the system that you've got, you can observe how it wobbles, and what you can then do is a computation with that. And one of the computations you can do with that is a feedback computation as a control system for the wobbling. So you've got an arm that is doing some kind of computation that is the control system for the arm moving itself. So you can close the loop in that way. And therefore, what you can say is that the body can be its own brain. And we know that when we're kind of trying to walk around and so on, the brain isn't sending precise, exact instructions to how to move. The body itself, through its dynamics, is managing to move itself in that way. So that's something that we're really wanting to do, is to figure out how you can do this more generally, that you can use the body as its own brain to control itself. Plus a little bit of extra brain probably needed, but it can do quite a lot. So this octopus that he's got is a cyber biophysical system. It's information processing, it's a biological system, and it's physically embodied in the arm. But it's not just the dynamics. Another important part that I want to look at is the growth processes. Growth and development is a very integral part of biology. I said, it's a self-producing system, and the way it kind of produces seeds, and the seeds grow and then produce more seeds and so on. And there's a whole sort of sub-branch of generative systems where you can actually define, mathematically define various systems that can then mimic things that look like growth processes, from very, very simple ones to actually ones that are that look quite like real life things. I mean, I think the one on the bottom right definitely looks like it could be real plants, but they're being generated by these kind of systems. The simplest one that many people will know about, something called L systems, which is, again, is a very simple mathematical approach, but you can use it to generate lots of things with the environment. So you grow these two trees together when using exactly the same rules that if you grew a single tree, when I say grow, obviously, I mean simulate in the computer. You grow a single tree and it looks like a tree, but you grow two close together and then separated apart. You notice they haven't grown symmetrically because they've been in competition with each other, and the growth has been stopped when the trees are close together. And then you can also have other environmental feedback where someone can actually come in from the outside and say, no, that branch should be cut off. So there's this whole thing which is known as synthetic topiary, where you can grow these strange shaped things. And the L systems come in a range of things. What's interesting about them is you can have different rules and you get different outcomes. And so how do we actually, what formulations might we have for being able to talk about growth systems? There's a variety of them. And in fact, classical computing very easily does growth. You can change the size of the state space in a classical computer trivially by just going new or malloc or whatever, and suddenly you've got more memory that you're using, you've got a bigger state space. And that's much harder to do in classical dynamical systems. So it looks like object orientation might be an interesting approach there, simply because an object's got state, it's got structure, and it's got behavior, which is the process, and it's got an identity. So it could be a simple model of one of these systems. And artificial chemistries is another approach that I've been taking along with some colleagues that are sitting hiding somewhere in the audience there, which is look like chemistry. Atoms can come together and build more complex molecules, and those systems can grow as well. But a big problem with a lot of these things is that although computationally they look very neat and clean, they don't actually have the messiness that you need potentially for life. They're discrete state spaces. You've got one thing, then you've got two things, but you've never got 1.5 things on the way. And if you look at the cell cycle, which is the picture here, it's not the case that you've got one cell and then, spontaneously there are suddenly two. There's a complicated splitting process that's going on and so on. And so you kind of have kind of times when you've got 1.5 cells. So you need continuous state spaces, but you probably need ones where you've got continuous and discrete stuff as well. And the real problem that I want to try and tackle is the fact that a lot of these systems are closed. I talked earlier about the self-modifying code. If you really want to do simulations, and frankly, although I might have been a physicist a long time ago, I've been a computer scientist for the most of my life. I write simulations. I don't go and get my hands dirty in the lab or anything like that. So, and the problem is, if you write a piece of code, it is that code, and it can't move outside that code. And in fact, Tim over there, I remember very well, it was way back, we were on a flight back from a conference in Copenhagen, and we spent the whole flight ranting to each other about a talk that we had been to, where someone was trying to have something that was open-ended, where it was blindingly obvious there was no way it could be an open-ended system because it was a fixed piece of code. I don't know what the other people on the plane thought, but and so that was a branch of work that started from there, and this open-ended stuff, and then I've been taking it on further with Simon on some of the stuff on these assembly language chemistries, and that's some of the stuff where how can you build a system that can modify itself? How can you have self-modifying code? You can do it at the assembly language level, but it gets it wrong and it can wipe stuff out. It's really, really hard to understand what's going on. We had a few runs of this system and then spent a long time looking at what had happened to try and figure out what was actually going on. I mean, we ended up with a system that was almost as incomprehensible as biology in that case. So, we need to figure out how to do this. But I think this is one of the key things we need to work out. How can we get open-ended, evolving systems that can change themselves in an open-ended way, not just closed, with a few parameters that you can change. So this is a key point there. The change, there's going to be something called metadynamics, and somebody in the audience might say, are you using meta in the right way? And there, you can also call it second-order dynamics if you want to. Dynamics is how things change. Metadynamics is how the dynamics changes. And that's the thing that's really difficult to get into current systems, is how the dynamics changes as a result of the way the system changes. This happens all the time, again, in life. Dynamics can easily change, like changes in gait, how you walk. I was going to sort of try and do a walk and a trot and that, but won't do that. But you can think of a horse. It can walk. It can change its gait to a trot. It can change its gait to a canter. Those are different dynamics, but they're not necessarily You can always think like I've switched from one to the other and it was always there. But actually, if you think of a human growing, they start off as a small toddler and they can't really walk very well. They crawl, but then they can't really walk very well. And then they get older and their gait changes. But that's because their body has changed, unlike the walk and the canter. And then they get, more coordinated maybe, and then they get older again and it sort of go off again. But that's as over the lifetime of the system, its dynamics changes because of the way the system itself is changing. And that's kind of really interesting stuff to figure out how on earth you could actually understand how those kinds of changes could happen. So as I said, the metadynamics is the way the dynamics changes, and then of course you could have meta-metadynamics, which is how the metadynamics changes and so on, because of course I really am a computer scientist and therefore if you can do one level, then there's obviously an unbounded number of levels above that you can do. So in this dynamical systems idea, the theory is really good for what are called closed dynamical systems. They don't have any input and they don't change over time. And that's what all the classical nonlinear dynamical systems theory is about. And that's really useful and important, but it really, in order to get a full theory of zoetic systems, needs to be changed. Now, there is a theory of open dynamical systems where you've got input going into them, like that physical reservoir computing I was talking about and various other things. But really, it's these constructive dynamical systems where the system itself can grow and change its own structure and change its own dynamics. And there really is very little theory about how to do that. And that's another area that in the future. Yeah, so this retirement of mine is actually going to have to last for about 200-300 years, I think, in order to do some of this stuff. Okay, so physics of living. So this was all computational stuff, a little bit about physics. A lot of physics is about equilibrium systems. They're closed, they're isolated, they minimize free energy, they maximize entropy, all that kind of stuff. Life is not an equilibrium system. Like, an equilibrium system, or death is an equilibrium system. You know, a pile of goo when you die, it moves towards equilibrium. Life is a far from equilibrium system, and it's an open system, and it's a driven system. And some of the concepts that we know from thermodynamics are not well understood. I'm not necessarily going to be working on these particular ideas, but I need to take them into consideration that some of the physics that we're doing is nothing like the physics that I learned 40 years ago. Okay, that's moved on quite a bit. But interestingly, because of some of the work that I've been doing with my colleagues from Sheffield on these magnetic systems, got interested in these things called metamaterials. So material, as I said, matter has structure and dynamics, where the structure encodes the information and enables the dynamics. But metamaterials are highly engineered materials that have novel functional properties. So you can have a metamaterial that maybe has different electrical or optical properties. You can give it even different mechanical properties so that if you squash them, they deform into interesting ways and so on. So we can think of a metamaterial as a highly engineered material. But then if we think about biology, all the really complicated molecules that are absolutely essential for life on Earth are highly evolved biopolymers, which we can think of as highly evolved metamaterials rather than highly engineered metamaterials. And so metamaterials are really important. You've got to have that complexity of structure. So you can't just have sort of brute structure, that like a pile of sand or something. You've got to have something highly complex in order to encode the complex information and the complex dynamics that you need for living systems. So a lot of people with metamaterials say you can engineer in functional properties, but actually, of course, you can engineer in computational properties as well. And so in some sense, that's what physical reservoir computing is engineering these materials to have complex computational properties. So it's smart functional materials. And so as I said, living systems are embodied in these either highly engineered for artificial or highly evolved smart functional metamaterials. And so sometimes you hear people say, we're not mere machines. No, we're machines, but yes, I agree, we're not mere machines. And the difference, I think, is a mere machine has a simple dynamic. So you think of a machine in a factory turning out widgets. Okay, so it's got a fairly simple cyclic dynamics: widget 1, widget 2, widget 3, widget 4, and it has what we would say a trivial metadynamics. That dynamics doesn't change, and any metadynamics is usually due to having to repair it because it's broken down, or having to reset it because it's got itself into a strange state or something. So that's what I would call a mere machine, sort of like a big clockwork thing. Then you've got computational machines, which are much more interesting. They've got a non-trivial dynamics. They're unpredictable. I mean, we've got the halting problem or whatever. You cannot predict what the system is going to do in general. You can in specific cases, and we often want to do that, but not in general. But even with computational machines, the metadynamics itself is again simple, and it's reversible in principle. Have you tried switching it off and on again, in order to get it back to the state, or even just do a factory reset to get it back? You can set it back to its original state. Then living machines are much more interesting. They've got a non-trivial, unpredictable open dynamics, but they've also got a non-trivial, unpredictable, open, and essentially irreversible metadynamics. I can talk about growing from a toddler to an adult and then getting a bit older. Unfortunately, I can't go back, and it's really difficult to go back. So that's the difference. Living machines are essentially open and unpredictable, both in their dynamics and their metadynamics. So we've got a nice set of different machines here. So therefore, I can come up with a definition of what I mean by zoetic science. So it's the science of self-producing, far from equilibrium systems embodied in smart functional metamaterials with non-trivial metadynamics. And now you know what all those words mean. Okay. But it's a highly interdisciplinary topic, and it's going to need input from all these different areas and more. And clearly, I don't know much about any of these things. So one of the things I'm wanting to do in my retirement is carry on working with people across these interdisciplinary boundaries in order to be able to advance, even by a small amount, some of these ideas. But how on earth are we going to get to that science? Okay? So science can be described as studying the world as it is, studying the world, what actually happens in the world. There's a nice phrase by a colleague of mine, and the reason we do that is to build models of increasing explanatory and predictive power. So science, the world as it is. Engineering, I define it as making the world as we want it to be, or at least, hopefully, at least changing the world, and sometimes it doesn't quite work out as we want it to be. And we do that by building artifacts of increasing sophistication and capability. So a little history lesson. So classical thermodynamics, I did learn this back in my physics days. Not while it was being developed, but after that. So classical thermodynamics today is or possibly the fundamental core of physics. And yet it was originally developed to meet an engineering need. People were building steam engines and they wanted to know how efficient the steam engines could be. And they didn't know, so they invented thermodynamics in order to answer that question. So science followed engineering in this particular case. So I'm suggesting that one way of doing this is maybe to take a page from history and focus on zoetic engineering. Designing and manufacturing zoetic, i.e. living artifacts of increasing sophistication and capability, and using that to help kickstart and ground the development of the science of understanding what on earth is going on under these things to build these models. And also, on the way, developing some cool new technologies This is the mad scientist part of me coming out at this point. But which artifacts and which application domains? So thinking about construction, today construction, the technology that constructs an artifact is separate from the technology of the artifact. So that's why I say it's an allopoietic system. So another fancy word, allopoietic means other producing. So as opposed to autopoietic, which is self-producing. Living systems are self-producing. The technology is both the artifact and its construction approach, construction and maintenance. So here's a possible grand challenge, and this is way, 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 way future. But fortunately, I got an email from EPSO today saying that we've got permission to put in a Network Plus proposal to build a community that are interested in this grand challenge. So that was fine. So growing a skyscraper, that's the grand challenge. Can you grow a skyscraper? Growable matter, you need to design and engineer the material that has got the capabilities of growing, autopoietic metamaterials. And then how do you program and guide the desired output so that it grows a skyscraper and not a big blob that, of goo that takes over the world or something. Do we actually want to grow it? Is there a difference between growing and building? So growing is when the system itself, like a plant, grows and the cells, the components are themselves growing and dividing. But termite mounds, the thing that's doing the growth is the termite mound, but it's being grown through a building process of the termites putting whatever they've chewed and excreted into particular places. So maybe you could combine these by having growing and building together, that the growth can exploit building. So if you do gardening with a trellis, you have a trellis and then you can grow stuff up the trellis, or you can train things in different directions. So you can use gardening to tailor the growth process. And why actually build the parts that can grow themselves, but some things are potentially easier to build than grow. So growing, building and gardening all in one, so you can have a spectrum of this. And thinking about all these different things needs consideration of all the things that I've talked about, plus a few others. So you could have growing biometamaterials, and you could have termite-like builders, and then you could have termite-like gardeners changing the structure. And so that would give you your zoetic engineering, which needs the zoetic science to progress. So that's the big picture, and as I say, I'm only one little tiny termite within that big picture, maybe adding my little points towards it, but that's the big picture that I'm interested in. How do you develop a new discipline of zoetic engineering and a new discipline of zoetic science? So just to conclude, we've got this picture here of the very first steam engines, very, very primitive, and we moved on to bigger, better steam engines, and then we moved on to flight, and then we got to Pluto. Today, we're probably at this point, and the thing that I'm talking about, the equivalent of being at Pluto, is that point. We've got a long way to go in between. But this bit of how do we get there from here, James Burke in his Connections program that I remember watching when it first came out, and I've seen some bits since, he was talking actually about the top line of starting with steam engines, and actually not getting to Pluto, because we hadn't got to Pluto by 1978, but he was certainly talking about the Apollo missions and so on. And what the people at that first point would have known, and I think his statement, at no time in the past could anybody have known that what they were doing then would end up like this now. And I think it's going to be the same in what we're doing there. We're kind of here. That might be where we end up. We might end up somewhere completely different. But what I want to do in my retirement is take at least a first step towards that. Thank you.
Finally on the same stage. Woo! Any questions?
Other than am I
Yes.
completely mad? Yes.
Susan, that was very nice. You talked about echo state, random neural networks, and only having to program the output layer. That made it sound like that you're taking a random error correction code, and from that you're doing the learning from that random error correction. Do you know if anyone's thought about it in that way?
I've not heard of it in that context. I don't know if any of my other
Because there'd be
neural
some
network people have.
there would
have
be
heard that.
some
That's really
constraints
interesting.
on how big the output had to be relative to the input.
Oh yeah, obviously if these things, there's a limit on the computational power of these things, which is actually more a limit on how much you can observe. Because obviously a physical system has got 10 to the 23 degrees of freedom or whatever, but if you can only observe 3 of them, then that's the limit on what you can observe there. But yes, there's definitely limits on the power of them.
Yeah, it's very interesting.
Yeah.
Okay, any further questions? Paul?
Hi, Susan. Thank you very much. A great talk. Not that I claimed to understood much of it. When you were talking about sort of the difference between continuous and discrete systems, so computational, traditional computational systems are discrete, isn't it just a matter of counting? Everything is discrete. There are no continuous systems.
Yes, but we don't want to have to go down to the quantum level to be discrete of those things. Certainly, eventually, you do get down to the discrete stuff, but quantum's just weird anyway. And also, you want to be able to have approximations. We're building models and things, and you want to be able to work at the level of interest. And at the level of interest of a lot of these things, the models are continuous. There are some people who actually confuse the model with reality and see that there's a real number in the model, and therefore a real number's got an infinite amount of information in it, and therefore you can do something fantastic. But then they confuse that reality isn't a real number, that's just a model. But it's a good enough model for that level, and you need that. And obviously, you write down a differential equation, it's continuous, and then you solve it on a computer, and what happens? You discretize it in order to integrate it. Yeah, but it's really the conceptual models. Yeah.
So a follow-up to that would be the transition from discrete to continuous is usually a matter of scale. It's the fact there's an enormous number of things that you stop counting them individually.
Yeah.
Is that possibly why we can't do things with digital computers? We just haven't got enough chips, let's say, or transistors.
I think part of the thing also with the digital computers is the fact that they are more discrete than they need to be, in the sense that they don't have the same dynamics. You're sitting in a state, and the clock ticks, and you move to the next state, and you've then dissipated all that energy, and then you move to the next state, and you've dissipated all that energy.
Right.
Whereas the continuous ones are more like kind of skiing over a undulating landscape, and you can. This is why I like when you go to digital radio from analog radio, your batteries go flat.
Right.
Yeah.
Okay. Thank you.
Okay, any further questions yet?
PhD students are not allowed to ask me questions.
Oh, yes, sorry. I was just wondering, when you were talking about the zoetic engineering and the building the skyscraper and stuff, were you thinking in terms of kind of harnessing actual biology, sort of, so, I don't know, having sort of some kind of system which would use actual termites or something, or are you thinking about an entirely artificial system, or a combination of the two?
I think really it depends. You would potentially want to be able to have any and all of those components. It's probably easier to start off with thinking of just artificial ones, because biology is messy and complicated and impossible to understand. And you kind of get this feeling that you want to be able to understand it, although I'm not too sure by the time you get to something that's actually living whether it will also be messy and complicated and impossible to understand. But yes, that's the thing that I showed at the beginning. If you've got your artificial organisms in concert with your real organisms and so on, So in the discipline of artificial life, there are the top-down and the bottom-up people. And the top-down start with existing stuff and mess around with it to make it do different things. And the bottom-up people start with non-living stuff and try and put it together so that it comes alive.
Thanks.
Okay. Ian, time for one quick question, I think, and then possibly we'll move towards the plot for food. And
I'm sure people are much more interested in the food than the questions. Thank you. Yes.
First, an apology. My timing was wrong. I've missed most of the lecture, but what I have seen is so exciting. Really thrilling. Well done. But I have one quibble. Computing machines, I challenge the reversibility. From an assignment statement upwards, information is lost that cannot be recovered.
Yeah. Yes. I wasn't talking about things. I mean, they're dissipative systems. They're definitely, but you can put the computer back into the state it was earlier, plus a load of entropy. Okay, so that's fine. That's just it excretes waste, and I wasn't considering the entropy. Yeah. If you want to do exact reversible stuff, but that wasn't the kind of reversibility that I was actually talking about. Yeah. But I agree. Yeah.
Okay. Okay. Thank you very much, Susan.